that we really are like, in some ways, having an important debate over this battleground of like, what is acceptable to laugh at, what you know, what's the direction of the punch going,
Mm-hmm.
how does that affect the comedy? Like, I think people get really riled up about these debates over especially stand-up comedy because it means so much to people, and we need it, but we can't, you know, deciding what is permissible or acceptable in comedy is like it's a microcosm for discussing like what's permissible and acceptable
Mm-hmm.
in society, you know, in terms of behavior in general, and what our attitudes should or shouldn't be. And I'll just say as an aside, I also, I mean, I'm obsessed with Mel Brooks,
Mm-hmm.
like deeply, deeply obsessed. But I also grew up listening to a lot of George Carlin stand-up
Mm-hmm.
on CD, and especially in his very late grumpy old man phase.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know, this 13-year-old kid, like shaking my fist at the state of the world, you know, with George Carlin, who's probably like in his 70s at that point, doing this
Yeah.
one HBO special a year. But what I find interesting is like, we could talk about this later too, but the relationship between comedy and transgression,
Mm-hmm.
because George Carlin's stuff to me was so exciting at that time because it felt like he was saying what you weren't supposed to say, and it was dangerous, and it was, you know, but he was also, and he wasn't coming at it from a politically left perspective per se, but he was
Mm-hmm.
coming at it from a, like, I'm calling out hypocrisy where I see it kind of
Yeah.
way. Now, though, you get into these insane debates, or that I feel they're insane, where it's like people on the right are saying like, or people on the left are saying you're not allowed to joke about this or that, and it's censorship a little bit. But then on the other hand, there's such an industry in like quote unquote transgressing that it's
Right.
like, you know, oh, are you going to cancel me for saying blah blah blah? And it's like, no, you just got a $1 billion Netflix deal.
Yeah.
So what does it mean for a society when transgression, which is so integral to comedy, when you're transgressing against a basically center left social order, transgression for its own sake isn't going to cut it. And I think it's these times have sort of forced us to rethink the value of transgression in comedy, and like, who is the target? Because it's not the 1950s and we're all shaking our fists at like the conventional nuclear family. You know, it's like
Yeah.
things are a lot more complicated now.
And it's really interesting that I think a lot about the comedians that I'm drawn most to are the ones who will talk about topics that in theory, like you say, like I feel like there's like this one level, like you said, where the, left-leaning people will say like, well, we really shouldn't talk about these things, and right-leaning people will say like, well, I'm gonna talk about this because look how hardcore I
Right.
am. But they make the same tired, stupid jokes. And then there's these
Right.
people
Right.
who they are also like very left-leaning, but they're the more, in my mind, um the more established and like well off comedians who know, like Patton Oswalt,
Mm-hmm.
Anthony Jeselnik, even like Tom Segura, who just did a comedy
Mm.
special, just came out, who I liked some of it and not, but like they'll talk about topics that in theory other people say you can't talk about them. And they'll say like, well, no, you can. It's just that you have to approach it, and there's always angles that you can talk about things where they're not offensive, but they still discuss the topic. Mark Maron does this all the time, where he'll say like,
Mm-hmm.
you can talk about these various things, you just have to have an original thought, and B,
Right.
have to accept consequences that will come from whatever your thought is. And it's like, and that to me is something that has gone away, like you said, not even just from comedy, but like society at large, where I get so frustrated talking about politics. I'm not shy about the fact like I'm very, very left leaning. My entire
Yeah.
family
Yeah.
is. But to me, it's like it's exhausting to even try to have a conversation about anything political, because there's like no middle ground to even have a discussion. It's just like either I think you're the worst person in the world, or you think I'm the worst person in the world. And so it's like, when you can, at least the rare times where I'll meet someone who I actively disagree with, but they'll at least have a conversation with me, it's almost shocking now. And I feel like it's the same thing with comedy. It's like when a comedy special or a movie or something comes out that at least has something interesting to say, it then garners so much attention because so few people are willing to be interesting, or at least have a a thought, because it can be easy just to say like, oh, X group of people, they're terrible and here's why. And then you're going to get a bunch of people that are, it's just like a dog whistle. They're just going to say like, oh yeah, thanks so much for saying that. We think that too.
Right.